It's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Held off the pages loud and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 19 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. So we got 3 papers this week to go over, so it should be as long as last week, the last 2 weeks where we went over 4. So the first article this week on Substack was China's third plenum could solve its demographic calamity. Ukraine seeks a new peace formula, and Europe's goal for a common air and missile defense system. So the first one is going to be China's third plenum could solve its demographic calamity. I kind of stuck here on this one, this pronunciation. I've heard plenum and plenum, so I'm going to stick with plenum. So this was the third plenum. Typically in a 5-year election cycle of the Chinese Communist Party, they have 7 plenums. The third one always deals with the economic issues. This third plenum has been delayed because of economic challenges in China, and I think the delay was largely attributed to the fact that the Chinese leadership had to think about what direction they were going to go as far as economic issues. Now, the plenum focuses on long-term economic matters, such as things as deflation, overvalued property market, elevated government debt. It usually does not look at issues of short-term economic pain or some type of prescriptive measure to address those short-term economic pain. But the slowdown in China has become a matter that it looks like it's actually going to change their long-term forecast. So they expect slower growth in the future. So that was published as part of the plenum. So that was plenum. And that was why it was considered that they delayed because they were going to release news that they were going to expect slower growth in the future. And it wasn't going to be a short-term economic slowdown. It was going to be part of their long-term expectation of the Chinese economy. That is not too surprising. At some point, as the economies got more and more developed, they do start slowing down. But there's a lot of macroeconomic headwinds that are in the Chinese economy. I talked about concerns of overvalued property, almost like they're having their 2008, 2009 moment in China that the U.S. had in the Great Recession here in the United States. So they have a number of macroeconomic issues that are facing the Chinese government debt, both on and off balance sheets. A lot of their debt is high amount of local debt. And part of this is by housing crisis because much of the targets that are given to the local governments to meet economic targets, a lot of that revenue for local municipalities is through property sales, apartment sales. And that has been slowing as part of this housing crisis. So that the local government is in they're in a crunch situation with also having reduced economic growth and a high amount of local debt. So these are all things that are carrying on into the Chinese economy. Very different on how sovereign debt works in China. So it's definitely where the local debt, oftentimes ignored by a number of institutions that evaluate the Chinese economy. They used to not consider local debt because it's not like it is the way they do debt in China. It's not like it does in the West. And so oftentimes it was overlooked, but has become so large and so pervasive, it's something that they can't ignore. And this is all things that are dragging on the economy of China. So China has come up with a decision as part of their long-term economic growth, they want to look at self-sufficiency in science and technology. They are one, again, the way the statement comes, this came directly from the statement after the plenum. And it is considered that this desire to be self-sufficient in technology and science is a response to the West and its allies that have been attempting to limit China's access to high-tech products. Obviously, China does produce high-tech products, but the high-end microchips, the superconductors, those are things that have been limited to China because of number of factors. First off is they are considered a challenge to the West, but also intellectual property. China is well known for stealing intellectual property rights. So obviously these are things that they want the international community, especially the West and the Western aligned countries, want to limit China from being able to acquire this product. So the idea is that if China becomes self-sufficient in science and technology, this will prevent outside forces from hindering China's progress towards becoming a preeminent power. The idea is that China is arguing that the West and its allies are trying to keep China down by limiting them from obtaining these products, these high-tech products. So it becomes a blame game that the Chinese Communist Party gives to its people and allies, saying that the West is attempting to hold China back from being a world leader and are trying to, even to the extent that they state that the West is trying to destroy China. Again, a lot of it is self-inflicted by China because of their aggressive foreign policy in the South China Sea, their lately favoritism of supporting the Russian war, not through direct arms sales, but through other means. And the fact is that I'd say probably the aggressiveness, the territorial aggressiveness, and the stealing of property rights. These are all things that China has kind of brought this onto themselves for this Western reaction. China, like always, China is never at fault. When you listen to their press releases and their mouthpieces and their state-run newspaper, or it's mostly party newspapers, China is always the victim of a world that is out to get them and that they have no fault of their own. And so they definitely do not go into the point where they reflect of what they have done to themselves. Now, what is interesting about this high-tech solution that they talk about, becoming self-sufficient in science and technology, is I'm an economist, as I say in the beginning, and land, labor, and capital. If any of you have taken basic economic courses, you've heard that over and over again. China has been, until 2022, for a very long time, the most populous country in the world. So labor was in abundance in China, and also China is a large landmass country, so they had the advantage of land. So their competitive advantage in the world was cheap labor and abundant land to be able to build more facilities to build. They became known as the factory of the world. So they were able to leverage their labor. Now, where this comes in there is that India overtook China in 2022 to become the world's most populous nation. That means that China's labor pool has shrunk. So the less labor, the more expensive that future is relative to the past. So that means China's labor costs are rising when compared to what they were just a few years ago. And the population of the world is still increasing. So that means that, again, China's relative cost of labor is going up, which makes them less competitive, especially when a country that is seeking to displace them as the factory of the world is India, which is now the most populous country in the world. So this is a problem for China. So here's the extent that has happened. So China's labor pool in 2021 was 747 million people. In 2022, it had dropped to 734 million people. Now, China does have an early retirement age relative to the rest of the world. I think women can retire as early as 50 years old, or maybe 55. Depends what men are doing. They can retire as early as 60, 62. So they do have, that does shrink their labor pool, but their overall population has dropped as well. And I believe the number, I can't remember off the top of my head, I think they've dropped 6 million people in a year. So they have definitely been on the decline. So as their labor pool shrinks, as their population shrinks, the relative cost rises. Also, as you get fewer and fewer workers available, they have to pay they have to support the workers that are working, have to support the economy to keep it going, to pay for all those supposed benefits that are given to retirees. China just simply, I know they're a communist country, but they cannot simply just not pay the retirees, because then you create social unrest, and that is something that the Chinese, all communist party or communist governments try to avoid civil unrest as much as possible. So they do not want to destabilize their society, so they have to come up with a solution to this. So I argue that, so there says land, labor, and capital, is if the plenum was talking about science and technology, that will provide capital. That means that they can create more machines, more robots, more other products to make them, robotics to make their products cheaper, to expand the efficiency and productivity of their current workers that are still in the labor force. So just like here in the U.S. is, maybe 50 years ago to make a car took a factory of 600 people, where now the same factory can make same number of cars with 150 people. And now a lot of that comes down through robotics. They could start shifting also. China could start shifting. If they go to a science and technology base, they could start shifting from a production type, where they're not industrial capacity, where it's not so much an industrial-based economy, but a service-based economy, financial services-based economy. Now, I don't see any communist country ever becoming a London or Singapore or New York when it comes to managing finances, because who would want to go to a communist government to do financial services? But there's other services they could do as they start getting a shrinking more and more labor pool, if they really embrace science and technology. Now, was this intentional as far as the third plenum? They viewed their demographic issue as a reason to embrace science and technology? I don't think it was. And that's why I think they really missed the boat on this, is that, yeah, maybe this could help them in the future. This was about short-term, mid-term preservation of the Chinese Communist Party. Was the West was limiting their ability to get the most advanced computer chips and semiconductors, and this was just a way for China to try to find a way to assert itself in what it believes as being a preeminent power in the world. So they weren't thinking about land, labor, and capital. But if they are successful in this, and I'm not saying one way or the other whether I want them to be successful or not, except, I have a general loathing of the Communist Party in any country. I think they have, this could be an advantage to identify this demographic death spiral that China finds themselves in. So how significant is this reduction in the former world's most populous country? One interesting thing is communist dogma asserts that humans possess the ability to create a utopia in achieving the perfection of a socialist state. And China has been no exception to this. It's Stalin was famous for trying to make these big earthworks types projects to change the natural environment. You look at like the Aral Sea, projects like that, and just how big of failures these were, and how much of an economic catastrophe they were. Chairman Mao of China had the thing with the sparrows, where He thought they were eating the corn, so he ordered all Chinese people to catch an X number of sparrows through this year, and the sparrows were eating the bugs that were eating the crops. So in the end, what happened was it created a mass starvation event in China. So again, they tried to mess with nature, and they ended up creating a catastrophe. So it's not unlike communist dogma to create these natural disasters of their own making. Now, it's not to say that capitalist or market-based economies don't make the same type of issues, but you don't hear of Western countries or democratic countries creating a system that turns around and leads to mass starvations or mass killings of their populations. So what was China's other issue that really created the state that they're in? And that was the one-child policy that was implemented in the late 1970s. I think it was created in the late 1970s, was implemented in 1980, and it was meant to reduce population growth. Now, all of you that were alive back then and were aware of the situation is the big buzzword in the 70s was world overpopulation. Also, the Great Ice Age is coming. So they talked about the world population, that there wasn't going to be enough food to feed all these people. And so even in the West, discussions had come up about the idea of need to reduce the world's population. So the Chinese government came out with the one-child policy. And again, the idea was to reduce the population growth. And China looked at it from the point of view is it was a way to reduce poverty because not so much expended resources needed to be spent on food or raising a ever larger population. Again, you're talking about 1980. China was still a very poor country back then. So the amount of the economic activity that had to go into producing food was significant. So they look at if they could reduce or slow down the rate of growth. And if you're talking about one-child policy, you're talking about actually reducing future populations. This was a way for China to basically allow more money to be put in the economy and make the relative worth or the GDP per capita go up by just reducing the future population. So the Chinese leadership also embarked on a program at the same time as the one-child policy. The Chinese leadership has also started embarking on a program of urbanization to move the population to the cities to harness human capital. Again, put people in factories. It's also easier to control people when they're in centralized locations. High density areas are much easier to control than trying to patrol out in the countryside, because you don't want people thinking for themselves. We can't have any of that. And the one thing you run into is when you're talking about a rural population, having more children is beneficial to the populations that live in these rural counties, because it often you're talking about family farms. The amount of labor or more kids you have, you're increasing the labor pool that you have available to make yourself more productive. Farms are more productive, especially when you're talking about 1970s, 1980s China. And the U.S. was like this at some time too, was the more labor you had out there on a farm through more kids, it made you more productive, made the farm more productive. That, again, certainly the case was true in the U.S. and other Western countries. So, but when you embark with urbanization, kids now, you don't need so many kids, because chances are you probably work in a factory, or you work for the government, or you work in some type of office job or something like that. And kids in an urban environment, you don't have a big farm. Now kids become an expense. So there's a lot less motivation to have larger families. First off, you're limited in a smaller space because you're probably living in an apartment. You're living in a high density location, so it's not like you can expand outward. So these are cases where just the limitations of larger families, there's a lot of limitations of larger families in urbanization environments. So the incentive to have larger families was being pushed downward in the urban environments. And this applies everywhere. This applies all throughout the Western world. The advanced non-Western world is, as you move away from a rural to an urban environment, you start having less and less kids. And that's why you see the birth rates are falling, because as more and more urbanization is occurring, the less need you have for kids. And even now, as you look at advanced farms now, is a lot of them are much more, they have a lot more capital equipment that helps them run mechanization of farming, so it reduces the population or the need for larger families in urban, in the rural settings. But it doesn't completely eliminate it, again, because you have space out in those locations that you don't have in a highly dense city. And again, you're talking about cities in China that are centrally planned, so they're not reacting to the needs of the people, they react to the needs of the government. So it was those two policies, forced urbanization and one-child policy, was led to a lot of bad outcomes in China. So the traditional Chinese belief was dictated that the firstborn boy carries on the family line and are responsible for their parents in old age. The daughter is not responsible for her parents once she gets married. So talk about Chinese dogma is, okay, the Chinese Communist Party dogma, as much as Chairman Mao tried, he was not able to eliminate the traditional Chinese beliefs, which, again, if you're going to have only a one-child policy and you're a mother, husband, wife, and you only have one kid, it is better for your future, again, with traditional Chinese beliefs, is that you wanted a boy because that boy would help take care of you and would also carry on the family line, that's the family name. So the government's mandate of a one-child policy led to parents discarding of the firstborn daughters or terminating the pregnancy if the child was discovered to be a girl, even to the point of child was born, find out it was a girl, child is abandoned. And there was a series on Netflix, I wish I could remember the name of it, and it talked about this policy, just a very gruesome policy. So you go in there and say, well, that's just propaganda. That's not that doesn't happen. Well, when you start looking at the distribution patterns of males and females in China, it is significant. For the total population, there's 105 males for every 100 females. That is a significant change in the normal distribution pattern of a population. And you're talking about China, you're talking about 1.4 billion data points. This is a significant change in the demographic distribution of the Chinese population, and it gets worse. So you think it's 19 to 24, it's 116 males for every 100 females. That means you have a large portion of your population is male population is never going to get married. They will not be carrying on the line because they will not get married. Now, you're also talking about the Chinese population. They are, especially in China, they are not bringing in a lot of refugees. They are very much, if you're Han Chinese, you marry Han Chinese. Now, that's not 100% given, but again, you're talking about traditional Chinese beliefs. So there's not a lot of intermarriage. There's not a lot of population stay within their groups, even though it's a communist society. You can't break some of their belief systems. So it's just, so you're looking at a large portion of the population is just out of whack. Again, 116 males for every 100 females. That is not accidental. And so China can't deny that they would have accounted for this disaster. Now, the other thing is, when you got a bunch of extra young men out there that have no prospect for a job, because remember, growth is slowing. And then you go on top of this is they've got no future. They're not carrying on the bloodline. They're not, they're probably, again, not going to get married. How are they going to take care of their kids or their family when, again, no large portion, no wife, no kids, and the jobs are starting to slow down in China. How does that look for domestic or societal stability? Um, Sometimes if you want to try to avoid stability issues, domestic issues, you energize your population in some type of nationalistic endeavor, like war. Um, One way to focus yourself off the domestic problems is focus on something outside and create blame for them. So this does create a lot of stability issues. Now, is this say that China's going to go to war over the one-child policy? No, but when you look at there's no slow economic growth, you've got a lot of extra males that have no real chance of having a future, whether through employment or through just a family. On a traditional Chinese belief, this does create for an odd situation that China is going to have to address, and they're going to have to find some way to address it. So, and this is the other part that is this population decline in China is basically irreversible. China is expected to decline from 1.4 billion at their high point, I think in 2022, down to 767 million. So their population almost goes to half. Now, there is a range. One says they could top out at 1.2 billion, or they could go down as low as 489 million. So it's a pretty big range, but pretty much it's going to cut down. Basically, by the year 2100, their population will be half the size of what it was 78 years prior. This is how much the decline is in China. So the other thing, if you want to become a great power, it might be China's time now to establish that now, then rather than waiting for their population to decline and for societal pressures to come up through destabilizing the hold of the Communist Party. Now, again, are they going to do this? Probably not, but there is there will be an incentive to pursue these types of policies. Get them while the getting's good, as you'd say here in the U.S. Southeast, or get them before they get you. And so there is going to be a lot of pressure on China to deal with the slowing economic slowdown, but also this demographic time bomb they have created for themselves that they cannot get themselves out of. I saw one projection is that to keep your population even, every woman has to have, and I say woman because they're the only ones that have babies, but you think about normal pairings, it takes two to tango, it's 2.1 child per woman to keep your population constant. That's what gives you your normal distribution pattern of typically it's like 100.2 women for every 99.8 men. That's what gives that 2.1 per woman is what gives you that normal distribution pattern. And so China is well below that. And it'd be prior to, I think, after the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, I think it was showing the average woman had just under 6 babies. And then by the time the one-child policy had come around, it had dropped considerably. I think it was actually below 3 by the time one-child policy came down, and it just kept declining. Then they brought up the China brought up the two-child policy, and it still declined. And they have the 3-child policy, and it's still declining. It's not picking up. The economic pressure, the changing in society where you de-emphasize having children has played a role in it as well. So now China is at 1.2 child per female, and that is not going to change. So China is in a death spiral that they're not going to be able to reverse themselves out of, just because they can't incentivize the population to have children. And again, it would take, once you start having children, you're talking about, let's say, a normal adult time from the time you plan to the time the child reaches adulthood, you're talking about the better part of 20 years. That would take you all the way to 2055. So at this point, they are basically in a death spiral. I think there's a YouTuber named Peter Zion who talked about that as well. A very, a very good. He didn't spend the whole video on it, but he spent part of it, and it was very good. And it does talk about the declining population, and with the declining population goes your labor force. So you go on top of that, President Xi wants to add more regulation to the economy because he is not a free market person. He's not a Deng Xiaoping. So he's going to be definitely not the free market person. He wants to add more control. And when you add more control to the economy, you're slowing down the ability of the China or of the economy to create a higher GDP. And you're talking about slower economic growth. So even if you could have good times where you could, there's more of a longer term prospect is maybe that can incentivize people to have more kids. But when you're talking about taking steps to also slow down the Chinese economy, not only through a shrinking labor pool, but through regulation in the economy, the long-term picture for China is not great. It's not dark bleak. China they can embrace technology and science, and they can become much more productive per worker, even though they'll have fewer workers. So it's maybe not a bleak situation, but it could be just by talking about the social instability that could be created in society that would take, the only way to correct it would be, or to prevent it would be some nationalistic event. There's other ways, but that's the one that concerns me the most, especially being a military historian and a economist, and especially when I look at the microeconomic, the way people react and how people live in the environment. Yeah, there is a lot of destabilization in China. You talk about a country that, especially when they start blaming the world for their problems and they see their whole system shrinking before them, yeah, it does create a stability issue. So again, things aren't bleak, but they're not favorable either. And it's how the government reacts to this that could change the course of Chinese society to make a soft landing. They're not going to avoid the demographic time bomb. They could try to do something to try to slow or soften the economic decline, but are they going to be able to get there? I don't know. I think with people like President Xi Jinping, I would tend to think not. And he is definitely one that's been rattling the sabers about going after Taiwan and the South China Sea and trying to bully his neighbors in the outside of the South China Sea, trying to pick fights with India, though that one seems to be up and down because I don't think that's something they really want to get into. But Xi Jinping's leadership has gone out to become more aggressive on the world stage. And I think that's something that's going to come back to them as far as how much countries are willing to help China, because China's not being a good neighbor. So how willing are you going to be able to partner with China or trying to find partners to help soften their economy? So, not sure. So, the communists, again, talk about the centralization of the economy and what that creates. So, it just doesn't look like Chinese Communist Party. Obviously, anything cannot fix that falling population. And it just doesn't look like the Chinese Communist Party is going to be able to step up and be able to do the right things to keep the Chinese population from remaining stable throughout this rapid change. Again, because you're only talking about it's 2024, so you're talking about 76 years. So China's population will be half of what it is today. That is just an incredible amount of people displacing. And they've got whole cities right now that are empty. And so this is a significant issue for China. And so I don't know if this is something that China's current leadership or even the future leadership, because Xi Jinping is picking the future leaders. I don't see that this China is up to the task, even though when you look at, hey, if they're embracing science and technology, this should help them lead them way out of it, and probably leaving the communist system would be another way. I just don't see that happening. I think that something of significant magnitude would have to happen in China to keep that from to keep that society from collapsing. So I talk about the Chinese system and societal order. That is a big thing in Chinese society, and even like the communist government is. For example, the 1917 revolution in Russia, where the communists came to power and eventually turned Russia into the Soviet Union. That was driven by food scarcity. People just didn't have the food to eat. It created societal disruptions that the Bolsheviks, the communists, were able to go in there and fill. The Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks. So they would go in there and they could fill that void where that societal disorder, saying we can give you what they won't give you, meaning the Romanovs, the royal family of Russia. So when World War II broke out, one of the focus items of Joseph Stalin was do not let people starve. Do not let enemies of the Soviet Union fill that gap. And that was a large portion of Western aid to Russia, was to provide them food. Now, I'll even go so far to is that with the Holodomor in Ukraine, Joseph Stalin used food as a weapon to destroy the will of society. So societal stability is an important part of any government, but especially in one that tries to control the population as significantly as a communist party government does. So that's more to come on that one. So I just think this is a kind of a disaster in making. Many of my younger people in that audience will see how things turn out. Of course, there'll be more written on there, but a real concern is a population that is going to be dropping rapidly in the next 76 years. All right, so the next writing was about Ukraine seeks a new peace formula. So this is going to the case of a lot of this is driven by I call it the failure of the original Swiss peace talks. And this is the one where you had the Ukraine peace talks with their 10-point plan. And by the time the Swiss figured out that the 10-point plan was not a way to go, they were already, Switzerland had already jumped in to help out with this new peace plan. So what they said is this time around is because one of the pushbacks from China, which is probably the only real country that has any significant leverage over Russia, is China, is first off, China refused to attend this first Swiss peace conference because Russia wasn't involved. Because why would you have a peace talks when you don't invite one of the belligerents of the country? So it was I don't want to say that peace conference was a failure, but it wasn't a success either. I wrote about that before. So when you go into that peace conference is, okay, we have to have the Russians involved. The Chinese will not be involved, which are the only country that can really put any significant leverage on the Russians to come to the peace talks. They've got to have the Chinese involved. So that means eventually they have to talk to the Russians. So Ukraine's President Zelensky is starting to formulate a new peace formula for eventual peace talks, what they're hoping in November. And this one, they are hoping to invite the Russians to this one. And if they invite the Russians, the hope is they will have more of a legitimate form of peace talks that the Russians will actually listen to. Yeah, it's wait to be seen, but it is definitely a step in the right direction. Is that if you're really truly serious about peace talks, you've got to involve the Russians. And vice versa, the Russians just can't have peace talks on their own without including the Ukrainians. Because the Russians have been somewhat on that side as well, where the Ukrainians are trying to dictate a peace to the Russians and not invite them to peace talks. Well, the Russians have also tried to dictate peace terms to the Ukrainians, which sounded more like surrender terms. So if both sides are truly, really serious about peace, they have to meet together. So, so what brought this on? So first off is the failure of the Swiss Peace Conference. The other one is the Russian summer offensive, spring and summer offensive, is not one that's trying to take wide swaths of territory, but it is one that is putting a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians and it is meant to create a lot of casualties. And this is something that the Ukrainians can't replace. It's heavy in artillery. The Ukrainians are short on artillery because the West's production of artillery has not been able to keep up with the Russians. The Russians aren't, they're doing, I would say, somewhat better than the West in creating artillery shells, but the West has been, or the Russians have been able to go to North Koreans to provide them with extra artillery shells as well. And there's also some EU procurement rules for artillery shells. So they have to still be sourced out of the EU. They can't go to another country outside the EU and buy them. So this is something that EU donate, because the EU promised 1 million artillery rounds to the Ukrainians that have failed to do that. They're trying to do some workarounds on that, working outside EU rules to help get Ukrainians ammunition. But so this is just something, if you don't have a lot of men, you need a lot of firepower. And so Ukraine needs more artillery. They need more Western weapons. The Western weapons are arriving. The artillery situation or the ammunition is getting better, but it's not great. It still favors the Russians and will probably favor the Russians through the rest of this year, and before you start seeing the combined U.S. and European Union artillery production start outpacing the Russians. So the Ukrainians are under a lot of pressure. They are losing a lot of manpower once they can ill afford to gain. The Russians are not interested in taking territory other than straightening a line, taking objectives, but they're not trying to do a blitzing situation like they did at the beginning of the war. And nor do they have to. They have established themselves in many of the Russian-speaking populations of Ukraine, mainly in the Donbass and the Crimea, obviously. And so they've taken 25% of the pre-2014 Ukrainian territory. If they start pushing further and further into Ukraine, they stretch their supply lines, but then they start running into the much more ethnic Ukrainian regions of the country. More men will need to be required for occupation duty. They expect to be something like Afghanistan, but on a much bigger geographic scale and probably in much more ferocity than what the Russians had to deal, or the Soviet Union had to deal with in Afghanistan. So the Russians does not need to take more territory. They just want to wear down the Ukrainian armed forces. And so the Russians' basically strategy involves, again, their strength is exploiting the weakness. Russians are using their manpower and firepower against this strategy of just pressuring Ukraine at certain geographical points along the line, create casualties through firepower. When the Ukrainians retreat, you don't give them any room to breathe. You follow right in behind them, or you start an offensive in another part of the line. You don't give the Ukrainians any respite. And it's a much smaller scale, but it's very similar to what the Soviet Union did in World War II to the German army, just constantly just applying pressure and never letting up. That's what the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians. Again, just at a much smaller scale. So again, the Russians are utilizing their strength, and their strength that they're picking directly correlates to Ukraine's weaknesses or apparent weaknesses. some of the firepower issues are starting to be addressed by Western weapons arriving that had been delayed. They're arriving. But again, it's not completely able to redress the balances, but it's getting closer. But again, that manpower issue cannot be over. Sending more firepower to the Ukrainian soldiers is not going to help the manpower issues. So the goal is, as I said, is just not give any of the space. I think the way I wrote it is that they basically consolidate their gains, fix the Ukrainian forces, and use their superiority to create casualties on the Ukrainians or force them to retreat. And as soon as they retreat, you follow up right in behind them and you keep the pressure on them, meaning the Russians. And it's a one that is starting to make a difference. So Ukrainians held, I think it was called the Razumkov Center, a think tank in Ukraine, did some recent public polling that put some pressure on President Zelensky as well, where now Zelensky has to think about if a peace formula that will be taken seriously, he has to change his way. But now he has to look at his population. Just like talk about societal stability in China, Ukraine has to think about that as well. What's happening is this polling outside of the occupied areas in Ukraine indicates that the Ukrainian population is becoming more pessimistic about the war, with 44% of Ukrainians want Russian and Ukrainian officials to conduct peace talks. So the Ukrainian government, outside of their intelligence services, have been pretty adamant that they were never going to talk directly to the Russians. I would say that it's indication that the Ukrainian population in non-occupied areas, so these are not necessarily ethnic Russians living in Ukraine, these are more your ethnic Ukrainians, stating that they think it might be time to start talking to the Russians. So that does support kind of what Zelensky is trying to pursue, but it also shows the softness in his population, a sort of war weariness. And he's going to have a hard time trying to avoid having talks with the Russians when his population is getting more and more weary of the war. Now, does this mean the Ukrainian population is going to give up? No, because it did cover some of the questions in the war. It says 83% of the population strongly opposes Ukraine retreating from the unoccupied parts of the Donbass. That's Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia, indicating that they are not ready to surrender to the Russians. And that was one of the Russians' dictating pieces. If you give up those four occupied or those four annexed regions, because early in 2022, Russia just declared those four Ukrainian regions part of Russia, and were first I think they said they were independent countries, and then said they became annexed inside Russia, but they're not fully occupied by Russia. So one of Russia's dictated terms to the Ukrainians was, well, just give up those four regions and Crimea, and then you could end the war. 83% of the population is opposed to that. So they are getting weary of the war, but they are not ready to surrender. And that's a pretty significant number. That's probably even more a higher support for continuing the war under those terms than you probably see from the Russians. Now, again, it does show the amount of weariness, because you go into the Ukrainians' conscription law. So some of their manpower issues was many critics in the West have said that it was delays in Western budgets to give Ukrainian the aid they needed, and that was true. But also the Ukrainians were going back and forth on a new conscription law, and that was not signed until about the start of the spring offensive. So that means that the Ukrainians were not conscripting the manpower they needed to continue the war. So it comes down to the difference in what happens is that Ukraine, the average Ukrainian soldier is in their 40s in the fighting the war. Now, this is partly by design, or mostly by design, is we talked about the demographic issues earlier with China. Ukraine has a very similar demographic issue. They are below replacement rate, so they're having less than 2 kids per woman. So that means their population in the long term is shrinking. So the idea was that the youngest adults were, many of the youngest adults were being excluded from conscription because the Ukrainians didn't want to give up a future generation of Ukrainians by sending them to the front and to the, I guess for lack of a better term, the meat grinder. So they withheld, and the idea is, okay, if you want to have more kids, you can't send your youngest adults into the war and hope for the best, and especially if you want to maintain a somewhat stable society and one that is above replacement rate for the future. So they made a purposeful decision not to significantly limit the amount of young men they sent to the army, to be conscripted in the army. That's why you see Ukrainian soldiers as being so old, so much older than what you'd see in any other Western army. So that had to change. The manpower issues were becoming so acute in the Ukraine army. They had to go back and redo the conscription law, and it was controversial. So what they did is, because they were facing so many manpower shortages, they did decide that they would allow more younger individuals to be conscripted in the army. Actually, a lot more. Now, not saying it's universally, it's probably about 50%, I think, of the young population is exempt. I think that's what the numbers are, something like that. And so they are going to allow more young men into the armed services. So they know at this point they're giving up some of their future generations over this war. So this has not been well taken in Ukraine, as only 46% of Ukrainians believe that refusing to do military service is not shameful, which again, that also indicates softness in the support for the war. So it again this is prescriptive for both the Ukrainian leadership to understand where is their population at, and is where will they stand on what will they support for the war and what won't they support for the war as they go into this peace conference with the Russians, or attempting to get a peace conference with the Russians. So the Russians, for their part, under Dmitry Peskov, who's a spokesman for the Kremlin, he did not commit to attending a peace conference, indicating that there's a lack of commitment from the Kremlin. Now, they didn't say yes, but they didn't say no. The former Russian president and former Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who is really one that represents the hawkish side of Kremlins or friends of the Kremlin. He's not officially in the government, as far as he doesn't work for the Kremlin or for Putin anymore, but he is a Putin ally, and he's viewed as representing the hawkish elements inside the Kremlin. He said that ending the Ukraine war is a Russian goal, or I'm sorry, not ending the war, ending Ukraine is a Russian goal, and they will do it even if it takes 10 years, indicating that even, and he even said if Mr. Medvedev stated that if even if a peace talks were started, if a ceasefire was started, the Russian goal was the same, and that was the destruction of Ukraine. This is much, much greater than anything that the President Putin is willing to do. And just what we talked about earlier, you're talking about trying to take a country and occupy it that will not be a friendly occupation to do. So that's probably something more bloviating than it is actual policy. And Putin would probably not accept this type of advice, but Medvedev serves a purpose for the Putin government. So Russia does have high public support and does have a battlefield advantage in the spring and summer offensive. So Russia is in a position where they don't necessarily have to go at this point to the peace table. So the Ukrainians have to find a way to incentivize the Russians to participate in the peace talks. Are the Ukrainians creating and generating enough casualties on the Russians? Well, the Russians can lose almost 4-1 and still be, or they can lose 3.5-1 and still come out ahead in a conflict. So they don't feel a lot of pressure in that. And then they're looking at, like, for example, you have North Korean brigades going to do some engineering work and de facto occupation duty in occupied Ukraine. So the Russians don't feel a lot of pressure at this point to join peace talks. Now, one thing they are giving up is the Russians, I wrote about this earlier, is that they have been able to grow their economy through growing their war industry. So that has created positive GDP growth. Elevated oil prices have also helped. China's economy going backwards is actually going to reduce the price of oil by, it already dropped by 1.5%. This does not help the Russians. So the Russians are giving up they're giving up long-term growth for short-term growth in their economy to keep the war going. Is the pain going to be immediate for the Russians to make them willing to go to the peace talks? No, and that's why the need for getting the Chinese to put pressure on the Russians to go make them come to the peace table is key to Zelensky getting into peace talks, or at least getting the Russians to participate in the peace talks. Because again, President Zelensky is starting to see softness in his population. So how much more can he keep this war going on one that there is some war weariness, not only in his population, in the West. So he has to understand that. So he has to find a way to incentivize the Russians to participate. The key is China. So actually the Ukrainian foreign minister actually visited Beijing this week. So not sure what has come out of those talks. I think the foreign minister was supposed to come back today. So I have not seen any updates on what happened to that. And that's also why the European Union, NATO at their Washington summit had talked about putting more sanctions on China. Again, China, they talked about slowing growth. So they're talking about the West putting more sanctions against the Chinese for them supporting Russia. They are trying to get the Chinese to get the Russians to attend peace talks. That's really the only way you can get them to go to the peace talks, unless the West is willing to give up some sanctions to give the Russians a carrot to come to the peace talks. So President Zelensky is in this position where he's already concluded that Ukraine must pursue peace talks due to the eroding support for the war, difficulty replacing battlefield losses, and the perceived loss of future Western aid. Many of the European papers talk about, if President Trump gets reelected as president, that means that it ends all support for Ukraine. That is overblown talk from the Europeans. I would especially say that a lot of it comes from the French side of the equation and other Francophiles that support that. That seems to be their point of view, and they're leveraging that for their own purposes. It's a boogeyman conversation that a election of Donald Trump will immediately end all support for Ukraine. That's not going to be the case. It's not going to be end support of NATO, but it does serve the purpose. So this is pushing President Zelensky to try to, again, thinks that there's going to be a perceived loss in Western aid. Now, my understanding is that Zelensky did have a conversation with President Trump like a week and a half ago. So I think he has been Zelensky has been a little less concerned about changes in administration. But we will see on that as well. But there will be definitely the conclusion is, and this was what was even the Ukrainian intelligence says, is they thought that they would have to go through the Russian spring and summer offensives, which again, we're about midsummer, so we still got a little ways to go before the Russians started talking peace. And that seems to be what the timeline looks like right now. So we will see. The unfortunate thing is that the Ukrainians were in the best position for peace talks in late 2022, when they had already pushed in their spring offensive, had pushed the Russians out of some of their overextended lines and put the Russians on their heels. That was the best time for peace talks, and they let that go by. So it's hard to negotiate a lot with the Russians. They don't have a lot of leverage going in there unless the West is willing to give something to the Russians to help them be willing to make concessions to the Ukrainians. So be interesting to see if Ukrainian intelligence was correct, and we'll see more and more incentive towards peace talks. But looking at the war weariness in the West, the war weariness in Ukraine, it does look like this is going to be more and more of a possibility. Again, I've been a promoter of peace. I think it's something that should have been pursued early on. My concern is it's not going to be a just peace for the Ukrainians, because the talks had lasted. They waited too long to have talks through Western pressure on the Ukrainians. But it's going to be tough for the Ukrainians to get what they feel is a just peace out of this. So more to come. The West will have to do something to incentivize the Russians to be a little bit willing to concede on what they could keep on the battlefield. That apparently it's going to be very hard to dislodge them from anywhere in their occupied territories. All right, so we're going to talk about Europe's goal for a common air and missile defense system. This is a proposal for European missile defense systems, basically lessons learned from the Ukraine war. And so the Europeans have come to the conclusion that they need some type of air defense system in Europe to protect their airspace, just as much as Ukraine needs more and more air defense systems to protect them against Russian air and missile attacks. So the Europeans are looking from the perspectives that they need some type of umbrella for their territories in Europe. So European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen endorsed a Greek and Polish proposal for a European air and missile defense system that is outside of NATO. Now, Greece and Poland are NATO countries, but they are focusing on the idea of Europe. So the aim is to provide a comprehensive air defense and missile defense system to protect the common EU airspace against all incoming threats. This is not new. Germany has created a system called ESSI, European Sky Shield Initiative. They have 21 countries supporting their initiative. They started this in 2022. France and Italy have a rival program that's not as big, but does have some interest inside Europe. And then now you have the Greek and Polish proposal going to President von der Leyen. So again, the German system is called the European Sky Shield Initiative, ESSI. It aims to establish a layered defense system using the German IRIS-T, the American Patriot, and the American-Israeli Arrow 3 defense system to create this layered defense system. Again, as I said, 21 countries in Europe have signed aboard to this. Now, the Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, he looked at it from two perspectives. Is it would provide protection to Europe, air defenses, but it would also spur defense spending in Europe by European countries. So he kind of had twofold that this was a reason, as a call to arms for Europe to create this program. France is working with a system where the American Patriot, the American-Israeli Arrow 3, and the German IRIS-T are being used. The French and the Italians are working on a system that's similar to the Patriot called SAMP-T, SAMP/T. And that is what they are proposing as a new air defense system. They do claim it's more sophisticated than the Patriot system and is more flexible and has more interoperability. It is a newer system. It probably does have some capabilities that the U.S. Patriot doesn't have. I think the Block 1 Patriots came out in 1990, actually in the late 80s, and they famously used in the first Gulf War. So obviously the SAMP-T is going to have some improvements that were not on the original Patriot. And probably even the new blocks of the Patriot probably cannot keep up with some of the changes from starting with something new. So there probably is a point to it. But interoperability, I don't see that as being, because I think most of the NATO countries run the U.S. Patriot system, which is made to NATO standards. So I don't see an interoperability as being an issue, except you're introducing another weapon system into Europe. When NATO already operates the Patriot in nearly every NATO country. So interoperability seemed kind of weird. It just seemed more like the French trying to talk down the system. So the Germans, this is where the problem is. The Germans program, it's not a problem, but this is where the French really, where they're starting to, not only are they talking up the SAMP-T program, they're talking down ESSI. The Germans chose a German, Israeli, and American systems for their system, and this is what they're saying to generate support or European defense dollars as a goal to spend more on a defense system. But only one part of the system is in Europe. The rest is Israel and American. So the French are arguing, and the Italians to a lesser extent are arguing, that defense dollars are not being spent in Europe on European-made systems, and that means it's not giving Europe the resources to create a more robust defense system or defense industrial base like you see in the United States. Now, they do have a point there. The issue, though, with the system, the SAMP-T system, is it's not operable yet. So it's the German idea is to get something out there to spur spending now, and something that is already available now in systems that could already be built, where that's not something with the SAMP-T. So the German position is get something built now. Also, you see, especially under Chancellor Scholz, is you're seeing the Germans move closer to U.S. positions, where under the previous Chancellor Angela Merkel, the French and the Germans were very close together. So you see this split where the Germans have moved away from France and closer to the U.S., and this drives the French insane. They've had all types of, or a number of issues with the French, or the U.S. over the Australian submarines, and then you're talking about this system. You had the French criticizing that the German and the U.S. is keeping Ukraine from being in NATO. So there's a definite rivalry with France, and France want to reduce the influence of the United States in Europe. And the French are looking to fill that void. So they're just using this as another leverage point between their rivalry with the U.S. Now, does that mean the U.S. and France are enemies? No. They just have, and they do have views on European security that are very much aligned. It's just a matter that the French want to make the EU they want to make Europe a power that's not reliant on the U.S. for military power. And he does have a point there, because obviously NATO is not just Europe, it's the U.S., Canada, Turkey, which is partly in Asia. So NATO is not, and the most powerful member of NATO is the United States. That means that the most powerful nation in NATO is the United States. That means the United States dictates European defense policy. The idea with the French is trying to get the U.S. out of being so influential, so that the Europeans can make their own defense decisions without having having to defer to oftentimes what they view as their economic rival in the United States. So, and that's where President Macron, that's where he really tries to push the SAMP-T position program over the ESSI. Chancellor Schultz is rather ambivalent about it. He says he doesn't mind the French system as long as it doesn't interfere with ESSI. So he says, just let the French be the French, as long as it doesn't interfere with his program, then he's fine with it. Now, there is some politics going on here. The French, the Italian, and the Polish prime ministers, the French president, the Italian prime minister, the Polish prime minister, and the Greek prime minister are all center-right political, so they're politically aligned. The European Union president, von der Leyen, is also center-right and from the CDU. The CDU is a rival party that has control of the German chancellery, or Germany, the chancellorship, is the SPD. So that is von der Leyen and Schultz's party are rivals to each other. So there is some play in party politics that are going in the decision. The other thing is the Polish and the Greeks are they're reluctant of getting closer to Berlin. They're concerned about leadership during the war. I know Greece had significant issues when they were going through their those very hard times with their economy in about 7 years ago, that they're still recovering from, but they're coming out from under it. Germany was very hard on the EU terms to give to Greece. And there is a lot of hard feelings towards Berlin. So even though they agree with Germany in the need for an air defense system, they are not really ones that want to sign on to the German initiative and give them more influence. But they're not signing on to the French one either. So they have turned to the EU to consider pressing for an air defense system. So President von der Leyen, who looks like she's going to get her second term, has agreed to commission an air defense and missile defense white paper and provide its findings within 100 days of the commissioning. Now, she supports the idea of a European air defense system. The issue that comes from this is the European Union is not part of NATO, and most countries in NATO are part of the EU. If this system that they're talking about creating is not a NATO system, and it's not an independent country system, this is an actual EU system, European Union military defense system. This is an arena that the European Union has not dealt with in before. For the most part, the EU position is that national defense and matters of defensive procurement are left up to the member nations. And for the most part, they defer to NATO when it comes to defense of the continent. Again, most countries in NATO are members of the EU. Not all, but most. So the idea is, if the European Union is going to pursue a missile defense under the European Union banner, how are they going to fund this? So the question, does this mean that it's going to take away, that countries only have a certain pot to give to defense dollars, and so 2% of it's going to go, right now NATO says NATO countries are supposed to give 2% of their GDP to national defense. If you start giving money to the European Union, or the European Union wants more money from the national governments in the EU, does that mean there's going to be less money towards to give to NATO to meet that 2% GDP obligation? That's a question. So what's the funding mechanism? Talked about Greece being in a hard position. Poland and Greece have actually given a large amount of their population, a large amount of their economic output, GDP, to defense. And I think I looked at Greece's numbers was like 3.5% of their GDP goes towards defense. So these are two countries that have been highly committed to improving their armed forces. So it was unusual in that area, but some of the other countries that are barely meeting that 2% or not meeting the 2% goal, how are they going to, is this going to further weaken NATO as dollars are moved out of the NATO defense budgets by individual contributors to the EU and moved to EU's missile defense system? Still to be answered, but there's only so many dollars to go around. And you could see countries talking in the budget process talking about, well, with 2% to defense is 2% to defense, and NATO will just have to deal with it. It will reduce some of NATO's requirements for air defense, but also NATO has to operate, could potentially operate outside the defense of the EU. So it doesn't completely cover, NATO doesn't completely give up all its obligations of air defense. So more to come on that one, but there's only so many defense dollars to go around. So this could actually weaken NATO funding. And it's also, there's no military structure in the EU. So it's kind of unsure how this goes about, because this is more than just agreeing to take on military systems. How do you, what's the structure for running this? What's the command and control for doing this? Now, the German-led ESSI project, for example, is not an EU project. The French and Italian proposal under SAMP-T is not a EU project. But knowing that way Macron has been discussing issues of EU and having more French influence in the EU, it is most likely the French intent, at least under the current leadership, is that if the French-Italian proposal wins out, this would actually eventually become an instrument of EU policy. And even President Macron of France has talked about providing not only nuclear weapons available, French nuclear weapons would be made available to the EU. He's also talked about providing French arms to give the EU a long-range strike capability to go along with the missile defense. So it just seems very much the French-Italian proposal could be a start, or it could be the what ends up being the EU program for air defense. So that's a possibility. I think that we will see the French, especially the French, lobbying for that. So that might be something that come up in the white paper. We will see 100 days, or call it 120 or so days. Where on the other side, the Greek-Polish proposal is a EU proposal. And that requires unanimous support from all member countries to establish this defense system. And again, not only is it the defense system, it's just the military structure, the command and control to go through to it all. This is probably going to take multiple unanimous votes for different sections to be able to support something like missile defense. It seems highly unlikely under the current EU structure that this will ever get passed. This doesn't mean that the German proposal doesn't have merit, or the French proposal, the Italian proposal, or the Greek-Polish proposal. It doesn't mean none of these have merit. It's just a matter of being able to go through the real politics when you're talking about a bloc that has, I think the EU is 20? I can't remember, it's like up around 30 member states. NATO has 32 member states, also requires unanimous consent. I don't see unanimous consent being made to be able to have an EU type system. It will most likely have to be something like the German-led ESSI, or some hybrid of it, or some combination of the French and German proposals to defend space, or it just might be EU countries align in their own system and try to operate within NATO guidelines. Not sure. It's interesting to see where it's going to go. I just don't see that what it's going to take for the EU to run a military defense system such as something as sophisticated as air missile defense. They will be able to do it without no military structure involved. Just do not see that happening. Do not see them having unanimous consent. It definitely shows that the the combined Europe, the Union of Europe, is still very much fragmented. The Ukraine war, again, I said that none of these systems all have merit, no matter which one you look at, whatever proposal. It has shown a gap in European defenses. Also, it shows gaps in the defense industries in Europe. Now, the U.S. has maintained a robust defense industry. The French as well, obviously not as big as the U.S.'s, but it has maintained one. The Swedish have also maintained, and the British to a lesser extent. But for the most part, the U.S. defense industry is much bigger than the European one. But the U.S. one is not big enough to be the old arsenal of democracy for advanced weapons. So it's not sure. So Europeans clearly need to build a bigger defense industry and maintain it. The U.S. probably needs to build a bigger one as well when they're looking at a possible hostile Russia or a hostile China, that they do have to look at being able to provide these more and more sophisticated weapons. And they're just not going to be able to provide them like they are, even much less than it was in the Cold War, where it used to be, say, a World War III in Europe was going to be as a come-as-you-are war, because you weren't going to be able to make enough weapons fast enough to replace the casualties. So what you had in your stockpiles is what you were going to fight with, and you weren't really going to be able to replace anything. Probably even saying that now it is even much worse off as far as that goes. And that's a definite gap when it comes to a war, European war, or a gap that the European war has exposed going in its third year. So it is a legitimate issue that they're bringing up. The Greek and the Polish proposal and the German proposal and the French-Italian proposal, these are all legitimate concerns for the Europeans and ones they need to address. Just not sure if they're in a position to be able to successfully implement one type of air defense system and have unanimous consent to do so. So that was the paper for this week. It most interesting, I think, is going to be seeing how the Ukrainian peace talks go. I think that's when you'll see some definite more movement on the air defense issue. That's going to be probably going on through 2025 before any decisions made. White paper doesn't have to be produced for at least 100 days after von der Leyen wins the second term as the European Commission president. So I'm sure we'll just hear bits and pieces from that, and we'll probably hear more from French complaining about something or other. The Chinese situation, that's something that's kind of off topic on that one, kind of on the different one. But in the long term, that is a major destabilizing factor in the world, to see how, think about your country's population or even your local population, and think about it rapidly declining by half in the lifetime of your kids. So that's how significant it is and how destabilizing it is. So those were the papers this week. Again, talking about going in, I think will be one more week of all free content, and then I'll be moving to a paid content, still providing free content. Is just, but if you want full access to all the papers, including the sourcing, you'll need to become a paid subscriber. I hate to do that, but at some point, I just need to be able to start protecting the information that I have, or I say protected, as I've said, decision came when I started seeing some of my work being uncredited on other sites. So at some point, I've got to be able to defend the copyright and intellectual property of this. So I will I still provide free content. I'm also looking at maybe there'll be some times where some of the paid content will be released at a later date in full. So I'm still going to work on that. But please consider becoming a subscriber. Also, if you, I will look, if you decide that you don't want to become a supporter on Substack and you decide to become a supporter on Patreon, I can make arrangements to give you full content of all the paid material. So that way that people that are Patreon supporters or paid supporters or subscribers on Patreon or paid subscribers on Substack or supporters on Patreon, you will have the access to the full content of my writings. Again, there will still be plenty of free stuff given out. I do notice that most of the longer videos and the long form papers are not read in full. Videos are not read in full, so that's where you see greater. The long version videos do not do as well as the summary videos. So I think a lot of it, the distribution will still go out there. So again, it wasn't an easy decision to make, but I think it's probably the right one in the end. I will again continue to provide content for all subscribers and all followers, so that at least you can get information what's going on in the world and see how my views of how all events or most of these military events and economic events are part of a everything's multi-causal. There's no one cause to explain what goes on in the world. When you're talking about people and societies are very complex, and you have so many variables in how all decisions are made. Again, I specialize in microeconomics, so I understand how I got very much focused on how decisions are made. And when you talk about multi-causal world and how people make decisions, so I do try to write about multi-causal events. So you will get that. You will still definitely get all that information on the free work. Just to get the full stuff or the full papers, it will be part of a paid service. But that'll be in going on this rest of this week, and all of next week will be free, and then we'll switch to the new formatting. Interesting comments I got on YouTube over the Canadian Achilles heel and the NATO's focus area of the Arctic. There's two places where NATO and Russia meet, and that's in the Baltic and that's in the Arctic. And so NATO sees the Arctic as being a area of concern to keep Russians from encroaching on NATO territory. So this is not something I said. This is something NATO has stated as being their priority. Oh boy, there were some Canadians who got mad about that one. Most were supportive, but some were just flat out pretty well, we'll say some pretty spicy comments on that one. And a lot of them were, they didn't think the analysis that I did was good, but then I read what they were talking about. And so somehow they didn't think that, you could explain all the issues with the Canadian Armed Forces in a 2 minute, 29-second video. You weren't going to get a full flavor of what was going on. I get it. It's a harsh thing when when your country is being criticized by internationally, and you get called out on it. There's a pride issue in that. So I guess I understand what they're getting upset about, but a lot of it wasn't my opinion. This is stuff this is information released by the Canadian government and NATO, and the point that the Canadians have taken it so seriously, the Canadian government has taken it so seriously that they actually have identified gaps that they need to fill in their military to address their security issues in the Arctic. So, but that was kind of funny. Got a lot of spicy comments on that one. So, again, it was no knock on the armed forces. I've worked with not many, but a few Canadian Armed Forces members, and these guys were sharp. These were really good professionals. So it's no knock on the Canadian Armed Forces, the individual members. Like so many other things, it's oftentimes the government that fails, not the individual. So definitely not to mean any offense to the Canadians and the members of the Canadian military. It's just pointing out some of the issues that they're having and some of the gaps that Canada has created in NATO priorities. So interesting comments. I appreciate the comments. I did write some explanations back to them and never heard back. So I just think they're, for the most part, they're probably trolls, or they were people that just, made their comment and moved on. So kind of funny, but I appreciate all comments that come that way. They did actually make some good points, and a few actually completely missed the points, but that's the way it goes. So hope all of you have a great week. Thank you for listening. For all my subscribers, followers, and non-subscribers that have read my articles and listened to my podcast, very much appreciated. Thank you for the support. And if you would like to contact me, I will leave my contact information. You can leave a comment in the notes sections of videos, or you can go out to the notes on Substack and send me a message. I hope all of you have a great week, and we will talk to you next week. Bye.